So assessment of malingering. How do we assess malingering? I've broken this down per type of domain. We're going to talk about mental retardation, intellectual disability first. Since Atkins versus Virginia in 2002, the Supreme Court's ruling prohibits the use of the death penalty in individuals with mental retardation. And they use the IQ test of 70 and below to determine mental retardation or not. One study looked at graduate students versus incarcerated young offenders. Both were asked to feign a mental handicap, and both were able to produce similar profiles for faking. So this is huge, especially in forensic arenas, because someone who faces the death penalty might then fake an intellectual disability so that they don't have to face that specific punishment. But what if you have no supporting evidence for or against? You know, what if you have no family or collateral information, and you've just got someone who's presenting as mentally retarded? So there's that. Another study looked at people with traumatic brain injury versus malingerers, and the result indicated that traumatic brain injury groups had comparable vocabulary and digit span scores, whereas malingerers had higher vocabulary than digit span scores. So this is something to keep in mind, is if you have someone with a much higher vocabulary than digit span, that could be considered an embedded symptom validity test. Another embedded symptom validity test using the WACE is digit span specifically. Digit span, you have 2 trials of 2 numbers, 3 numbers, 4 numbers, 5 numbers, etc. The WACE 4 then has digits backwards and digit sequencing. If the person in front of you is missing the easier ones and getting the harder ones, or misses one, gets one, misses one, gets one, misses one, gets one, they are giving inconsistent effort. So that's something to pay attention to, because if you're getting inconsistent effort, especially on something like digit span, then it calls into question the validity of the rest of the WACE and other tests of cognitive function. So discrepancies between tests and subtests is one of the biggest things that you're going to be looking for. I also do repeated measures where I'll give something like matrix reasoning from the WACE, and I'll give the TONI, test of nonverbal intelligence, because both of them are based on kind of the same thing, which is visual spatial problem solving. If someone has more than 1.5 standard deviations between those 2 scores, I know that they're giving inconsistent effort. Now, whether the malingering or just giving inconsistent effort is up for a different kind of discussion. Well, we're going to discuss that in a minute. But it is something that we need to pay attention to. It might be that they're malingering, might just mean that they're giving inconsistent effort. And people who give inconsistent effort aren't necessarily malingering. It might just be that they're bored with the test. Okay, so answering difficult questions while failing easy ones, not necessarily always on digit span, though digit span is one of the things that's been researched enough, and in the research it shows that it is one of the best embedded. But what about answering difficult questions to other tests? Say you give the RAT, for instance, and they're able to get the harder math questions, but not the easier math questions. That calls into some question about their level of effort. What about incongruity of social performance with presentation behavior? Oh. Okay, so I had this guy. I love to showcase this guy. Because I'm working at the SSI evaluating people. I get all kinds of people. And this guy had just gotten out of San Quentin, though I hadn't seen him, I hadn't talked to him. There was no information in there from me, but there was information in there from one of my colleagues, someone I knew and I liked, who actually cleared him from being in the mental health program and noted in that evaluation, which he presented to us. He got a copy of it and sent it to us. In that evaluation, it said that he seems to be exaggerating mental health symptoms. So I was already a little primed, but keeping my mind open. I did peek at him through the window, saw him with his two buddies, filling out the forms, talking and laughing with them, coming on to the secretary and asking for her phone number. And then, when I see him, he comes into my office and is completely unable to talk in a complete sentence. Worse than that, the nurse is about to take his blood pressure, and he goes into a little fit about the blood pressure cuff. She asks him to step onto the scale, and he jumps onto the chair. When I ask him to please come into this next office so that we can do testing, he starts making monkey sounds and says that he's not able to, his friend says, yeah, he does this, he's not really able to sit with anyone, and I'm like, okay, why don't you come in with me? Now, I normally would never see someone with their buddy, but I thought this is kind of cool. So I got their buddy to start talking about them and how, what did they do last night together? And he's saying, oh yeah, we watched the ball game and we had some brewskis and we did this and we did that. I'm like, where did you go? Yeah, we were at Applebee's. And I'm like, this is interesting. So of course I'm writing all of this into the report. But when it comes to incongruity of social performance with presentation behaviors, long story shortened, just a little because we'll come back to Guy. He walks out of the office, and I watch out the window, gets in the car, starts it up, and drives away. So you want to pay attention to all behavioral observations in your room with you and all around. Incidentally, he was not able to answer any questions about himself. He had no attention when asked about his criminal history or anything else, but he was able to tell me everything that was wrong with him with regard to mental health problems, and he was able to pay attention to all of the testing. When we get to the Tom, I'll tell you what score he got. So, what about insufficient effort? Insufficient effort is another thing that you have to pay attention to, and those are the things that you can look through between the different tests and whatnot. And impairments that are only in one area of life. Remember, how do we tell if someone has mental retardation? Adaptive functioning, that's one of the biggest things. So you have to have that adaptive functioning piece. And it has to be with social, occupational, ability to meet ADLs, whatnot. All right? So it's in many different areas. If they are only impaired in one area of life, I can't work. But he's able to maintain a house. He's able to pay his own bills. He's able to make appointments for himself. He's able to drive to the appointment. That's interesting. Cognitive disorders, watch out for cognitive impairment or lack thereof, including perseveration, inability to abstract, impulse control, and organization. Someone who's trying to present as having mental retardation or cognitive deficits will not necessarily be perseverative, where someone with a head injury might be. Right? They'll have the ability to abstract, and they won't really understand why you're asking, but they'll be able to tell you how pineapple and oranges are alike. I'd even go as far as to say they're both citrus fruits. You know? Implausible symptoms. When we talk about the tests themselves, when we get into the actual measures, implausible symptoms is one of the big things that keeps on coming up across different scales. Symptoms that don't necessarily always happen in the world, like every time I hear voices, my hands begin to sweat. Doesn't necessarily always happen. Psychotic symptoms. People with cognitive disorders don't necessarily have psychosis, but someone who's malingering might not differentiate between the two. So they're trying to malinger a cognitive deficit, and you start asking them about voices, which is nothing having to do with any of their records, and suddenly they're starting to hear things. Also, discrepancy between social and vocational functioning. That's what I just said. If they're able to go to the bar with their buddies, drink a few brewskis, get in their car and drive away and have an active sex life, then maybe they don't necessarily have a cognitive disorder. What about amnestic disorders? I had this gentleman who I was assessing who I still to this day don't know. I don't know. I do know he had antisocial personality disorder, but he said that he was in a car accident and he had retrograde amnesia for everything before the car accident, which I know is incredibly rare. It's incredibly rare. So, knowing what I know, I do all the testing with him. He gives great effort on everything. His only problem is that he's got retrograde amnesia for everything before the car accident, including his sex offenses and his other violent offenses. Doesn't remember any of them. Doesn't remember growing up. Doesn't remember that he was married 3 times. Doesn't remember his 7 children. So, I do the research, and the research really does show that there's really no way to tell if someone has retrograde amnesia or not. It's self-report. But the highest percentage of people who report it are criminal offenders, interestingly enough. And considering he did give such good effort on all tests showed that he had antisocial personality disorder. So I thought, even if he does have retrograde amnesia, it's really cool that his personality didn't change at all. I ended up telling him, you just don't want to remember. Go forward with a clean slate. That's probably the best thing for you. But it didn't really matter because he was really there for him, and it didn't have any bearing on him getting out or anything like that. So, if they have no history of amnestic episodes, if there's a presence of a personality disorder, if they have spotty episode-specific amnesia, maybe they're malingering. What I mean by spotty amnesia, episode-specific, I can't remember the crime, but I remember everything leading up to it and everything after it. I just flew into a blind rage, and I don't remember the crime. Yeah. Man, that suggests that you probably are really a danger to society, doesn't it? I've said that. I mean like that. All right. Recent familiar publicized case. If it's a highly publicized case, and they're saying that they have amnesia for it, it's probable, impossible, that they are malingering. And test for recognition memory, i.e. test for information that only the client being tested knows. You would expect them to remember personal data. You would expect them to remember different things. But if they don't, then... Right. Right. Or things that happened on their wedding. You know. So you want to test some of that, assuming that you know some of those answers. You want to test for that. The CVLT, the California Verbal Learning Test, includes some utility for detecting malingering for normal and mild traumatic brain injury, but not for traumatic brain injury or stroke victims. And you can also, for amnestic disorders, look for executive functioning. Overall test of executive functioning suggests that someone who might have amnestic disorder, especially if it's a psychogenic type of amnestic disorder, might still do well on executive functioning. Someone who has true amnestic disorder, brain injury, is probably going to have impaired executive functioning. Why? Because a brain injury severe enough to wipe out your memory is going to mess with your frontal lobe. Why? Because our frontal lobes are the last to develop. Our frontal lobes aren't fully developed until our mid-20s. So the last to develop is the first to go. Our planning, organizing, impulse control, emotional regulation, all of those things governed by the frontal lobes might be impaired, or more likely than not, mildly impaired with a head injury so bad that it's going to wipe out your memory. People with, who are malingering don't know that, and so their executive functionings will probably be within normal limits, so it's something just to look